And you can take it away now, Matt.
All right. Well, thank you, Stephen, and thanks everybody for joining us today. I guess in the light of the title of this program, we're in neither state budget or state shutdown right now, but we'll get into that in much more detail. First of all, I want to thank everybody for joining, and I really want to thank our two guests we have today. Joining us, Rachel Richards, who is the fiscal policy director for the Michigan League for Public Policy, and Dr. Tina Kerr, who is the executive director of the Michigan Association of Superintendents and Administrators. So thank you both. Ladies, for joining us today. I mean, this is a chaotic time, right? I think that goes without saying. I'm going to kick us off and I'll talk a little bit about where we're at the federal level, where we are in a federal government shutdown right now, and kind of some background behind that. But then I think, and I'll let Rachel and Tina address that in any way they want. And then I think the bulk of our time will probably be spent discussing where we are at with the state budget process right now in the chaos that is evolving as we speak around Lansing, around the state budget. And then, as Stephen said, we'll be happy to answer questions that folks have. So please just pop those into the chat at any time, and we'll get to those at the end. This may not go the full hour, which I'm sure people will be excited about as well. I'll give you a little bit of your lunch hour back as well. And I would say the other thing to note at the beginning here is that we'll probably be doing another one of these as soon as there is some sort of resolution to this to the state budget, so that we can give people some more details about what actually is in the state budget moving forward when this does finally get resolved. So I'll start, like I said, with the federal stuff. We are in a federal government shutdown right now, officially at midnight last night or 12:01 this morning, I guess. The federal government did shut down. And so the federal government is functionally closed right now. We have experienced federal government shutdowns in the past. The most lengthy one of recent note was during the first Trump presidency, Trump administration, I think back in 2018, when it lasted over 30 days. I want to say 35 days or somewhere in that regard. What's notably different about, I think, the dynamics around it right now, the shutdown that we're under at the federal government, is it really isn't a fight around funding levels, really. And so you're not seeing the level of concern, really, we're not, at least right now, from our federal government partners and advocates at the federal level. Typically when you have a shutdown or a big budget debate at the federal level, one side wants to cut funding specifically for areas and the other side doesn't, and you have a debate around funding levels. Really, that's not the case here. The funding, the levels, a continuation budget or a continuing resolution at continuation funding levels, really both sides are at the same point there. The Democrats are demanding that some other things be included, the extension of some healthcare subsidies related to the Affordable Care Act that are set to expire at the end of January. But this seems to just be, in general, a much more political messaging and posturing shutdown that we're seeing at the federal level. I'll say that nobody knows exactly how this is going to play out, and I think it remains to be seen, and a lot of it will depend on which side feels they're getting the upper hand from a messaging standpoint, and who's getting more of the blame for the federal government shutdown as this shutdown extends and goes out further. There doesn't seem to be any, immediate resolution emerging to this. And I think at this point, it's expected to at least probably go through the weekend. And then beyond, hopefully cooler heads will prevail and some resolution will get worked out and we'll see this. But it doesn't not, like I said, seem to be a fight about funding levels as far as programs that we're concerned about at Michigan's children, like Head Start, after school funding, childcare funding, and other things that are obviously critical to a lot of the issues that we work on that are directly involved that are supported by federal funds. And so it's a little bit different dynamic from an advocacy perspective from that standpoint. But we are under a federal government shutdown. It certainly will be driving a lot of the media coverage that people are seeing, which is interesting, especially here in Michigan, because of the same kind of chaos that we're having around the state government and the state budget at this point as well. But a lot of the attention from a media and public perception standpoint will be centered around the federal shutdown. Rachel or Tina, anything you want to add to that before we jump into the state stuff?
Yeah, man, I think you covered it fairly well. The one thing I would highlight is those enhanced premium tax credits that are set to expire at the end of the year. just so folks know, these are tax credits that folks use and families use in order to be able to afford healthcare when they purchase a healthcare coverage on the ACA marketplace. So these are families that qualify for these subsidies because they're low to middle income. They don't benefit from they don't qualify for Medicaid, and they don't have like insurance through their employer or through some other, or like their spouse's employer or whatnot. So it's really going to hit, it's about 500,000 Michiganders that have a um, plan through the marketplace that will be potentially seeing significant increases in their premiums and therefore potentially going without health insurance, starting as soon as potentially next year. So that is kind of one of the sticking points um, in this conversation. The other thing I would also highlight is this continuing resolution isn't using that same reconciliation process that we used to do the harmful federal mega bill from earlier this year. And it needs 60 votes in the Senate. So, there has to be some negotiation across the aisle in order to get a spending bill or a continuing resolution across the line. So, you kind of what we're seeing in Michigan, where we're having to kind of negotiate across, kind of the political atmosphere, they have to do the same thing in Washington. And, kind of that's another sticking point at this point.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks for pointing that out. Yeah, I should have mentioned that at the beginning. So it will require some level of bipartisan support to resolve this. And so that's why we're in this position and not like the reconciliation bill. And the other thing to your point about the subsidies is you're right. I mean, these are essential to making the Affordable Care Act work, right? It's this subsidies to make it affordable. And the reason, though, even though they're not set to expire till January 1st, the reason the Democrats are demanding that these things be extended now is the exchange actually opens now or will be opening soon for people to purchase their health plans for next year. And without those subsidies in place, those plans on the exchange will not be affordable to the families that need care through the program. And so that's why this debate and this issue is coming up now in light of this context and this funding fight at the federal level now. So I apologize. I should have done this earlier as well. Why don't Rachel and Dr. Kerr, why don't you guys introduce yourselves now, and then we'll get into a discussion around the state debacle.
Yeah. So thanks, Matt. I'm Rachel Richards. I'm the Fiscal Policy and Government Relations Director for the Michigan League for Public Policy. I've done a couple of these with Matt and some of the other Michigan children teams, so happy to be here. Not so happy with what's happening outside my door right now.
Dr. Kerr?
Yeah, Tina Kerr. I'm Executive Director for the Michigan Association of Superintendents and Administrators. This is my first one, so thank you for the invite. And I noticed by the picture, this budget has aged me quite a bit. So maybe I can blame it on the budget and not the fact that that might be 10 years old. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you both for joining this. And I'll preface before we start this conversation, and those of you who have been on these before and know are our regular a part of our programming at Michigan's Children know I tend to speak freely, and I'm finding it harder and harder to rein myself in light of what's happening right now. So I will continue to do that, obviously, whether I want to or not, I guess. But please don't associate any of my comments with our other guests. And we'll, kind of have a conversation here about what we know, what's happened to this point, what we know as of now, what maybe we kind of expect, or some scenarios that could play out as we move forward. And then, like I said, happy to answer any questions that folks have. This is complicated stuff. I'm going to talk fast because I get real excited about it. So please don't hesitate to ask any questions. Just pop them in the chat, or if something comes later up that you are concerned about or think about or have questions about, please reach out to us. My email's simple. It's matt@michiganschildren.org. You can find it on our website, but please, we try to be as helpful as we can to make sure people are understanding what's happening within our state government, as hard as that is. And so that's what we want to do. So where are we right now? So we don't have a state budget passed. We're not in a shutdown. We're in this neither category. So late last night, or actually early this morning, the state legislature did pass a 1-week continuation budget, which essentially is keeping the government and our state government funding and operating and running for 1 more week. So absent any more activity from the state legislature and the governor, we will be in this same, running up to a deadline again, like we were yesterday, a week from yesterday, a week from Tuesday at midnight. So the current continuation fund budget that is operated, the state is operating under will expire at midnight on October 7th, or midnight, I guess, October 8th, 1 week from where the deadline was. Now, how did we get to this point? Well, there's a lot, we've done a number of these programs on the state budget. This process has been messed up. I'm not going to spend a ton of time reliving where we are, but obviously we're operating in divided government. We have a Democratic governor, a democratically controlled Senate, and a Republican controlled state House. They've struggled to come together on passing a state budget. Typically, this process is done and over with sometime in late June, maybe early July. We've blown through that deadline. We've blown right up and now through the actual deadline of October 1st when our state fiscal year starts. There has been a lot of activity, though, obviously, in the last week, especially around where things stand. So last Thursday is kind of where I'll start. The leaders, meaning the governor and the majority leader in the Senate and the Speaker of the House, announced that they had an agreement on the framework of a budget deal. And so one of the big issues that's been a big factor in this from the beginning is this insistence on road funding and some long-term road funding plan being a part of any long-term budget agreement. And this has really been driven both by the governor and the House Republicans, and not so much the Senate Dems, but that's been an insistence from the beginning that there be a big road funding agreement be a part of any sort of budget deal that comes together. And so they announced that they had agreed on a framework of a deal that encompassed both a state budget and a long-term road funding plan as well. The framework of that deal, and I'm going to overly simplify this, but in essence, they agreed that they would eliminate the sales tax on gasoline. So currently, if you buy a gallon of gas, let's say it's $3, if you get a gallon of gas at the gas station, you pay 31 cents of that $3 is a gasoline tax. That money goes directly to road funding currently. And you also are paying part of that $3 is 6 cents on the dollar sales tax. Like when you buy a coat or you buy a pair of socks or anything else, you're paying 6 cents in sales tax on that gallon of gasoline. Well, obviously that sales tax revenue is largely big chunk of that is directed towards the school aid fund. Under Proposal A, this has been our funding formula for decades now. And so that's a big part of about $800 million a year of revenue into the school aid fund comes from sales tax on gasoline. So part of the framework of the deal was that they were going to eliminate that 6% sales tax on gas, replace it with an increase in the gas tax. So move that from 31 cents to 51 cents a gallon. So essentially the price of gas will stay the same, but the tax that you're paying on gas now will go entirely to road funding and not to the school aid fund. And so this is a big part of the long-term road funding plan that is a part of this deal. In addition, they agreed to a big tax, about a $420 million increase in taxes on marijuana as a part for local road funding, as a part of this deal as well. And then, and then some, it yet to be released. And that part was kind of made public as a part of this framework of the deal. But the actual details of the budget, they did commit as part of that as well, that they would hold the school aid fund whole. They would make the school aid fund whole for this year. The big sticking point, and I know this is complicated, but is whether or not the holding of the school aid fund, this $800 million from the school aid fund, if there's a permanent replacement solution for that $800 million. Nobody's doubting at this point, at least, that they won't this year do all that they can to replace that $800 million that'll be coming out of the school aid fund from eliminating the sales tax on gas. The concern amongst us, and I'm sure amongst Tina and a lot of other folks associated with schools and public education funding in Michigan, is that there's no permanency to that. You're taking essentially $800 million that every year would be going under our current system into the school aid fund and eliminating that. And sure, we're agreeing to replace it this year, but what's to say what's going to happen next year, let alone 4 years from now, 5 years from now, when we have an entirely different legislature, an entirely different governor. And so this permanent replacement of this sales tax hit to schools is a lot of what the unknown is right now, and a lot of what's causing uncertainty for a lot of us that are involved in this. And so that framework, like I said, was announced last Thursday. No details. So then they use that framework to then work out the final details on the budget, all behind closed doors, with no input and no opportunity for advocacy organizations like us, for the public, let alone the general public or others, to really be engaged and to see what the details are. Now, the word came out yesterday that they have agreement on all of these departmental budgets and on a school aid budget. but nobody's seen what it is. Nobody's seen what the actual details are, what categorical levels are funded at, and other things like free school meals and breakfast, like GSRP, pre-K funding, like after-school programs, like all of these other things that there's a lot of people obviously interested and concerned about. Nobody's seen what those are. But this thing was all rolling towards, going to be passed at some point yesterday with this framework of a deal, and then these budgets would be unveiled, and everybody would just get in line and vote for them. Well, that wheels kind of fell off that bus yesterday. Obviously, they were still negotiations happening on some of the levels and details within the budgets. But then where they really ran into the hurdle is the marijuana tax proposal. It had passed the House, I think last week even, did not get the votes to pass, or they did not have the votes ready to pass that in the Senate. So that put the brakes on this whole thing, because this whole budget deal is centered around this framework that was announced last Thursday that includes these revenue components being directed towards roads that makes all the rest of this work. I guess I'll pause there and let Rachel and Tina add in anything that I may have missed, or maybe better explain this to folks who obviously are not as entrenched in this as we are, fortunately for them.
I just you reminded me with the way you were saying it, it's kind of a shell game, but I think there was a song that was something about buying a oceanfront property in Arizona. It's kind of how we're feeling right now, is that they're going to take it that's there. Don't worry about it. But when you start, as we've learned from prior history with the school aid fund, once it's gone, it is very difficult, if not impossible, to get back. So I just want to reiterate what our concern is this idea of filtering off those funds without a permanent replacement is obviously very concerning. We've been told, we've seen in the media, don't worry, it's going to be the biggest foundation, People Foundation. Well, when you don't see those details, it's really hard for us to actually understand. And there's so many intricacies with school aid funding anyway, as we all know, all these little pockets and all the different things that, while it may be a larger foundation, what did they have to do to get to that foundation level, and what categoricals or other services are being cut? So our biggest concern too is what's in this? What is the deal? So thanks for mentioning that, but I just was reminded of that song.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think it's a both and, right? It's a concern about what's in the deal that they've supposedly agreed to, at least the leadership has agreed to now. But then also, what is the plan moving forward? What is the solution, or the permanency plan moving forward for this reduction in permanent school aid funds going into, or sales tax revenue going into the school aid fund? And then, I mean, there's a lot of other added components to this. I mean, we see, and Rachel, I'm hoping you can expand more on this. There's real concern about general fund moving forward. I mean, this year certainly, but then moving forward, especially as we look at some of the impacts of the reconciliation bill that was passed at the federal level coming into effect in the coming years, and what that means to the general fund moving forward. And and that's really exacerbated by the fact that we're doing all of these things to permanently shift these revenue streams into road funding when we have these obvious general fund concerns right ahead of us.
Yeah, and I'll say, we kind of historically have had a under-resourced general fund. It's a place where we quite often go in order to, do additional tax cuts or whatnot. And it is, yes, it's very important for us to hold our school aid fund harmless, but that quite often comes at the expense of our general fund as well. So kind of recognizing that, we have to take a look at the budget holistically. And Matt was definitely clear, we do have a couple of things that are going to become a little bit pressing on us as we start unrolling that federal mega bill that passed earlier this year. For example, I'll say one of the really important bills that's currently in the Senate was part of this revenue package that passed last week was this. It's called the insurance provider assessment, or I've been calling it the IPA. And what it does is it is a way for the state to raise money, the state sourced money for our Medicaid match. So in order for us to draw down federal Medicaid dollars, we have to put in a state match. And unfortunately, our insurance provider assessment is out of compliance. So what the House passed last week, and it passed overwhelmingly bipartisan support, was essentially a fix. So it provides kind of this stopgap measure to allow us to continue levying and collecting the IPA that we've been collecting for a number of years now. And then going forward, once it is deemed to be non-compliant, to allow us to go back and make a fix so that it's not going to necessarily negatively impact our revenues for Medicaid, and then, negatively impact the services we can provide through Medicaid or the reimbursements that we provide to hospitals, which are already fairly low and, will only be lower if we, start reducing both the state and federal Medicaid dollars. So that's a really important piece. We're hopeful that the Senate, pushes that through as, part of the agreement as well. And then, yeah, we'll see kind of some additional hits coming on the Medicaid side of things, also on nutrition programs. So the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, the state is going to have to start kicking in increased dollars to both our administrative match. So like the dollars that we and the feds kind of both combine in order to administer our food assistance program. And for the first time in the history of SNAP, we will also have to start contributing a state match. So we're going to have to find somewhere north of $400 million based on kind of where our current error rate is and where our current administrative costs are, in order to just maintain food assistance services for families that need the help in order to put their groceries on their table. So these are going to come, a couple of years down the road. It's going to be a crunch to our general fund that is already kind of constrained. And so we are concerned about taking a look at the budget this year and making sure that we have, the programs and the wraparound services in place to really be able to, help out these families. And I'll say, including, within the school aid fund and the K-12 budget, school breakfast and lunch. That is a great support for families with kids. I've got a ninth grader at home, and he likes that he can just go and get lunch at school, or breakfast at school when he's especially running late for the bus that we've had a couple times. So, it is a good support for families, and especially those families kind of on the brink of, they are one financial crisis away from needing support, but make too much to qualify for something like free and reduced price meals already. So really is going to have that huge impact if we're unable to have that. I've seen some assurances and some quotes that is going to be one of those things that's sticking around. But, we are all still waiting to see the actual language of the bill too.
Can I piggyback real quick off of that? Just because
Sure.
I think that's really important, certainly for us. We recently did a member survey and had about 270 of our superintendents surveyed about what if the budget's not done by September 30. And because you brought that up, Rachel, I think it's important. We had 42% of those 270 say that they would have to suspend the school lunch program. And like you, we're hearing that it's okay. A lot of them were willing to backfill, but when you don't know your overall budget, what are you backfilling and taking away from? Salaries are a big part of every school's budget, right? And so I think you mentioned it earlier, Matt, that by law, we were supposed to have our school aid budget by July 1. School districts are required by law to have theirs in. Here we are, October 1st, and people wonder why schools are scrambling, trying to figure it out because we don't have that. But I think that statistic's important. That was taken 3 weeks ago. If I took that same survey right now, I have a feeling that number would increase because the uncertainty is still there. So I just wanted to add that piece of information about we've been tracking that because that is a major concern because those are our most vulnerable and most needy families that they need that support in place. So I sure hope it's in there, like you said.
Yeah, no, thank you for mentioning that. Yeah, no, and that's an issue that's gotten a lot of attention. I mean, we were a part of a rally yesterday at the Capitol that, no, and so I think now what we'll do, so thank you for that. And I think, this is a good context kind of for where we are right now. And I gotta be, I understand I gotta be careful. I gotta be a little bit less careful than others, but I'm gonna get into kind of the politics on where we are right now and where some of this is. And like I said, please feel free to ask any questions in the chat. Heather, hopefully you can kind of monitor the chat and see if any questions come up and let us know. But I'll get into kind of some of the politics that are around this and kind of where we're at right now, and maybe we can try to look forward a little bit to see where this goes. So as Rachel alluded to, so two things. I mean, the House has actually passed some of the things that a lot of politically you would think would be more troubling or tough for them. So Rachel alluded to the IPA, which is a big deal, right? I mean, this is essentially an effort to try to not blow up Medicaid in the state and to do this IPA thing. And so the House has already passed that, and they've also already passed the decoupling bill. So we've talked about this in previous programs here. Another big impact from the reconciliation bill that passed at the federal level was the way that they reduced the corporate tax burden for federal taxes actually had a big impact on state revenues because our corporate income tax or our corporate tax in Michigan is tied to the federal tax rate that corporations pay. And so without this measure, it'll be about a 700 and some, almost $800 billion hit to our state revenues if we don't decouple our corporate tax from the federal tax. And there was a lot of concern on whether or not the House Republicans, this is a business, it will be portrayed politically as a hit on businesses, as a tax on businesses, on whether or not the House Republicans would agree to decouple our corporate tax from the federal tax. They did. They passed that. And so now that bill is part of this framework of a deal as well, is sitting in the Senate as well, and hopefully, and I think likely to be supported in the Senate with the Democrats' control of the Senate. But that's a big part of that as well. And so that's all these big pieces, the IPA and the decoupling, were part of this whole overall framework that was announced last Thursday as this big grand bargain, if you will, around this budget and road funding deal. And I had several conversations with several different House Democratic members yesterday who, were basically part of their mindset was, listen, we got the House to agree to the IPA and the decoupling. This is a win. This isn't a terrible deal for us moving forward. When you question them around what about, aren't you concerned about the permanency of the school aid fund, moving forward and other things? Part of the response was, listen, we got Hall to agree to IPA and decoupling. This isn't all bad. And I mean, that's the politics that are at play here, right? And so there's a lot of maneuvering still. And so what happened yesterday was fascinating, right? There was a race to try to get this thing done. Here's another political reality that I'll put out there and this has been since I was in the legislature 100 years ago, and I think long before that as well. Leaders would tell you that if you get a deal in a tough situation like this, where you're negotiating and there's different political sides, when you get agreement and you get the leaders to agree to a deal, you keep people there until it's voted on. If you let people go home and then, the advocates like us and the lobbyists and everybody else can start picking them apart, it's much more likely that any deal that's been agreed to is going to fall apart if, the longer you wait, once you announce that there's a deal before you actually vote on it. And so there was a real big push yesterday to try to get as much of this done and through and over with as they could. And obviously we're running up to, a government shutdown looks bad on everybody. You can blame who you want and say this person's to blame or this person, but nobody wins nobody elected that's involved in it wins when the government shuts down. Your basic job is to keep the government up and running and operating, and you're failing to do that, regardless of who you blame or what you try to do. But they obviously were running into problems, and part of this, and this is a functional problem, or I'd say a more foundational problem that we've had for several years, and obviously is getting worse and is being demonstrated as we speak, that the process is really broken in Michigan on how we do budgets. The public input, the transparent, the laughable part of one of the laughable things about this, there's many, but is this notion, that Speaker Hall keeps talking about transparency, and we're bringing transparency to this has been the least transparent process of a process that's been historically very non-transparent for decades now, but it seems to get worse and worse every year. And we've got a system where more and more of the decisions are made by fewer and fewer people at leadership positions in the legislature and with the governor. And this process has been broken for a long time. My one hope, maybe out of this, if there is one, is that this will finally lead people to the point where a recognition and an understanding that we got to change this, and there's a better way for us to do government in Michigan, and there's certainly a better way for us to do budgets in Michigan. And the process we're using right now isn't working, and I don't think anybody would argue that it is, especially today. So I'm hoping that we can emerge from this whenever this comes out, whenever we're done with this, and have a real conversation with a whole lot of folks involved around how we can make this process better, certainly make it more transparent, make more opportunity. I mean, our interest at Michigan's Children will be what can we do to give more opportunity for more people to get involved in this process and to be a part of it and part of the decisions that are moving forward. So all of that's going into this. There's a lot of politics at play. The wheels kind of fell off the bus yesterday when it became clear they didn't have the votes to do the marijuana tax piece on the Senate. And that's, fundamental to this overall framework. And that absent that, they weren't willing to release the details on all of the budgets because if you don't have the revenues that part of all of those budgets are baked, are dependent upon, shifts would have to be made on those details. And so, there was some more laughable moments, I will say, last night. At one point, the governor issued a statement along with the Senate Majority Leader and the House Speaker saying that government will just stay open because we say so. And, we've agreed to a deal. And so we're just going to let government and people that have been around this a long time, myself included, were like, what? You can't just say so, that's not real. And so then at some point, somebody, got to the reality started to sink in, and they did pass this 1 week continuation budget at about 1:30 in the morning or almost 2 o'clock in the morning, and it was signed by the governor so that we actually have a functioning state government that's legal under the Constitution right now because the legislature has appropriated the money to keep the government funded. But where this goes from here, I think there's still a fair level of uncertainty. We are running into some scheduling issues now. There's a Jewish holiday that begins at sundown tonight, that runs through sundown tomorrow, and there's a longstanding tradition certainly, and I don't think that it's likely to be broken where the legislature is not going to meet or conduct any official activity during that period. And so, a big part of this as well is that these bills, even once they're agreed to, have to be drafted by an entity called the LSB, the Legislative Service Bureau, whose job is to draft the legislation that ultimately gets voted on, and that takes a tremendous amount of time. I mean, these bills are going to be thousands of pages in length, when they're finally agreed to, and so that takes a long time as well. And so we're running into some scheduling challenges, and obviously the weekend is right in front of us. And so where this goes from here, I think there's still a fair level of uncertainty. To this point, the principals, so that meaning the governor, the majority leader in the Senate, and the speaker, are still sticking to this notion that they have a deal, that they have an agreement on these things. And really, a lot of the attention right now as we speak is focused on convincing or pushing or lobbying or cajoling, whatever you want to call it, some of the Senate Democrat holdouts and the Senate holdouts on this marijuana tax component, and really urging them to get on board and support this piece, or if they won't, then they'll have to find some form of alternative revenue source to meet that same number so that they can stay within this framework of a deal that they presented last Thursday. And then obviously the big other thing that a lot of us are looking at, and I know Tina as well, and all of her members, everybody else, the details have not been released. I mean, a lot of the actual individual members of the legislature that have to vote on this still haven't seen the details on these budgets. That's the part where the process is broken and that we need to fix and make that more transparent. But all of this, still has to happen. And so I don't know, Rachel, Tina, if you have any other thoughts on kind of where we stand right now and maybe where things go from here.
The only thing I would add is part of our other concern is schools are dependent on the state aid payment that was supposed to come October 20th. So by this being delayed so far, it is highly unlikely and somewhat impossible that they will actually see that payment. And again, talking to leaders, see that payment on the 20th. By the time it goes through, and Rachel's way more versed in how the money follows and moves, but that's our concern. If they were already struggling and waiting on that payment, we've had districts taking out high interest loans, having to pay those back. Now we may be looking at a first payment in November. What if it's continued? And the list goes on. And again, we're wasting taxpayer dollars, right? Those funds should be going to kids and programs. So that is a big concern for us too, is just we're already way past the point of no return in some instances for districts, especially with regard to their cash flow.
Hey Matt, we have a question in the question and answer box.
Oh, I see it. Do we know how the state budget is going to be affected by the federal budget? Is that what you're referring to?
No, it says,
Oh,
what are you hearing about categorical funding in the school aid budget? Specifically, we are concerned about funding for the Opportunity Index English learners in rural districts.
okay. So yeah, and I see one in the chat as well about the state budget. So, and then before we jump into these questions, Rachel, anything you want to add to what Tina just said about the timing of payments?
No, I would say, I mean, that is obviously something we're concerned about and watching as well. That payment does have to make it to schools. We have also heard that there are some, um, you know, school districts or ISDs that, with their Great Start Readiness programs that have payments that go out at different dates. So it's not all based on this October 20th date, that they have some that are going out perhaps October 3rd or 5th or 10th. And so not having a budget in place could impact their ability to really provide services for, our youngest, most vulnerable learners that are trying to get into, the 4-year-old pre-K program. So there's a little bit of that as well. I will say, we've heard that there are, there's going to have to be some runway to the payment. So the sooner we can get a K-12 budget in place where we know that the funding is going to go to the schools and how it's going to get to the, kind of in those amounts and whatnot to maintain those budgets for schools is really important. So again, sooner we can get it done, the easier it will be to make that October 20th payment. And we're just hopeful that we have enough runway by the time the details come out and by the time they pass and get signed by the governor to get those payments out and without having to affect the cash flow and the budgeting of our schools. So yeah, I mean, I'm definitely feeling for our school districts right now in terms of the uncertainty that they've been feeling. I mean, like I said, I've got a kiddo myself, and our superintendent has been great about communicating with us in terms of what the information that they can provide. But we're still all, I'll say, as a parent of a public school student, I mean, it is something that we are definitely watching. So.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's not, and yeah, I agree. I mean, obviously on the school, but it's not just schools either. I mean, local governments get state payments as well. And they're in somewhat of the same situation. All right. So I'm going to jump on the question about the state budget being affected by the federal budget. Then I saw we have a couple questions about categoricals that I'll try to address as well. So the question is, do we know how the state budget is going to be affected by the federal budget? I mean, our state budget is hugely impacted by the federal budget every year. I mean, a ton of the money that comes in that goes out in our state budget is actually federal funds that flow through the state. And mostly in what Rachel talked about earlier, I mean, the impacts from the reconciliation bill, which wasn't technically a federal budget, but the changes to Medicaid and to SNAP are going to have huge implications on our state budget moving forward as those come into effect. What's a little bit unique right now about the federal government shutdown that I tried to indicate in the beginning comments is that the shutdown right now is not really about funding levels. Both sides seem to agree that, we're going to continue federal government funding at current levels. It's whether or not these subsidies are going to be included or extended as a part of it. So I don't know that this current shutdown and how this gets resolved is going to have as big of an immediate impact on the state budget. But obviously, all of these decisions that are being made at the federal level, particularly around these big programs like Medicaid and SNAP and other things, and really in a real simple sense, what the reconciliation bill did is it shifted a lot of the obligation and burden for Medicaid and SNAP onto states, where it was previously the federal government was funding that through the federal government down to the states. And so that's going to have a huge impact moving forward if changes aren't made at the federal level. All right, so now we got a couple of questions about categoricals, and you're absolutely right. And so just for a little bit of background, a lot of this comes around from the original budget that, let's say, the Senate, the governor, this whole process started with the governor presenting her budget proposal to the legislature, then the Senate, then the Senate passed their budgets back in May, I think. Which were more closely aligned with the governor's, which were more what we would call a traditional or typical budget on the school aid sense, that had a per pupil foundation allowance and then a number of categoricals where specific funding for specific programs, like the free school breakfast and lunch, like pre-K, like Great Start Collaboratives, like the Opportunity Index and English language learners, right? And these are relatively new categoricals that have been a big part of the budget and something we've certainly advocated for at Michigan's Children in recent years. And then the House didn't do anything. Then the House finally passed a school aid budget that essentially eliminated almost all of those categoricals and put all of that money or most of that money into the per pupil foundation allowance. And the argument was, well, let's just give the schools the money on a per pupil basis, and they can decide if they want to do free breakfast and lunch, and they can decide if they want to do pre-K, and they can decide if they want to do these things. So it was a fundamental difference in the way we've done school budgets, and a big philosophical difference from what the Senate had passed. And so a lot of the concern right now is how are those things going to be reconciled? What are we going to ultimately end up? Are categoricals going to be included or aren't they? And there's not a lot known. I mean, this is the center of the concern that everybody has without this being released, right? They say they've got an agreement on a school aid budget, but nobody's seen it other than maybe three people that were in the room when it was agreed to. And so nobody knows what categoricals are in. Now, there has been public pressure building around the state, especially like on the breakfast and lunch program that Tina referenced. And so as one of the statements that was, there were statements flying from the leaders at different points yesterday. One of the statements that came out, Majority Leader Brinks in the Senate was very clear to intimate that the breakfast and lunch program was included in the deal to try to, I'm sure, assure folks that are most concerned about that may, be safe moving forward. So, I mean, that one, I guess you could feel pretty good about. I mean, it would be, but if the whole thing blows up, and we get back to if the framework of the deal blows up and the revenues aren't being supported, that maybe doesn't hold at this point, right? And as far as the other categoricals, I don't know that anybody knows. Certainly that's the crux of the concern that a lot of us that are paying attention to this and really engaged have had for days now is that the details are not coming out. And, until those details are released and are seen by folks, it's nobody can take a position on, this agreement or this deal that they have because we don't know if collaboratives are going to be funding. We don't know if out of school time programs are going to be funded. We don't know if pre-K is going to be funded at different levels and other things. And so, Tina, I don't know if you have anything else to add to that, but I mean, that's really a big part of where the dynamic is right now and the uncertainty around this is where we are at with categoricals.
Yeah, that was my big push either. We have advocated for quite some time about rolling up categoricals into the general fund as long as we know what those are and that it's, an apples to apples type comparison. So I think you said it well. It is definitely something to watch and pay attention to.
So I see another question in here about as a licensed home program that participates in CACFP, will reimbursements be delayed with the federal government shutdown? Rachel, I don't know if you have any insight on that. I mean, there's been very little that I've seen come out in regards from the federal government at this point. Now, I mean, we're only 12 hours into this shutdown, I guess. But as far as guidance or information about kind of how these programs are going to be administered and paid for. I know one of the big concerns that a lot of us had as we headed up to this date is that if we did get to the scenario where we had both the federal government shutdown and a state government shutdown, there could be real disruptions. I mean, in insurmountable, I would say, disruptions to a lot of these programs, because even if the federal government would be able to release the payments in some way, there would be nobody at the state level to administer these payments and these programs out to the recipients. And a lot of these programs are administered or recipients receive these payments in different ways. Sometimes it is facilitated through a state program. Sometimes it's direct to recipients from the federal government. And I would say there's a lot of uncertainty in there around this.
And Matt, if I can interrupt, we just got an email this morning from the First 5 Years Funds, one of our national partners. And is that administered through the CCDBG grant?
The CACFP, I'm not sure.
That's nutrition. I'm not sure.
I'm not sure
We will
either.
be trying to post as much as we can from national partners as soon as we see it about resources and the impacts on shutdown of the programs.
Yeah, I'm expecting that we'll see a lot more come out even maybe later today and in the next couple of days from our national partners around, and what I've seen in the past when we've had federal shutdowns is even guidance for us on how to try to get our, state agencies to respond or react in the event of a federal government shutdown, about how to try to administer these programs. What's, like I said, unique in Michigan right now is we're operating under a chaotic system within our state government. Most other states aren't in this position, right? Most other states they have a solid, they know what their state government is doing, but they're dealing with the impacts of a federal government shutdown. We have a federal government shutdown, and we don't really know what our state process is at this point either. So I see another question here about, I thought Michigan was not able to pass a CR for our state budget. We are not. And so what passed at 2 o'clock this morning or whatever is not a continuing resolution. So at the federal level, what they do is a continuing resolution, which just essentially continues government funding at current levels. What they passed in the state legislature last night or this morning was called it was essentially a budget, but it was only a 1 week budget. So if you think about it this way, and I'm oversimplifying this a little bit, but what they did is essentially they took our current 1 year budget that we were operating up until midnight yesterday or this morning, and they divided it by 52 and said, we're going to appropriate 1 week's worth of that budget, that money, that number to all of these programs so that everybody can keep doing what they were doing for one more week with those dollars. And so it's not technically a continuing resolution. It is a continuation budget. I mean, in essence, it's the same thing. And I think it sets I was on a different call this morning with a number of folks who are very concerned that this sets a really bad precedent moving forward. If we get into a scenario, God help us all, that becomes a common theme every year where we just blow past deadlines and do 1 week budgets and maybe 2 week budgets and other things. That's a bad scenario for us from a governance standpoint moving forward, regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum. That's just not a good way to operate a functioning government.
Yeah, and I would say the last time we did one of these was 2009. It was a very short term, another like 1 month band-aid, essentially, stopgap measure. Then we call it an interim budget. And yeah, so it just essentially allocated 1 month's worth of funding for state departments in order to make sure that they had could pay their people, and so that folks would be in the buildings to be able to provide the services that we all rely on. So if you called a call center, somebody would be there to pick up the phone. If you were expecting to get a school aid payment or a local government payment, those dollars would be able to be, transferred and stuff like that. Essentially, like we just are. So yeah, it's not exactly a continuing resolution similar to like what we have federally, but it's just like a little stopgap measure. And again, we used it back in 2009, but very different economic situation back then. We were hemorrhaging jobs, we were losing revenue, we had year-over-year revenue losses, and just didn't have enough to be able to pay our bills and provide basic services. So this is a very different situation than when we were in back in 2009. And I think definitely have some concerns about making sure that once we get to the end of the week of funding that we have a budget in place that funds our vital services.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I'll get on my soapbox just for a quick second because I can't help myself. But 2007 was another year where this was an issue, and I was directly involved in it. But the difference at that time was we were raising revenues. We were operating. We had no money. The state had no money, and as Engler went out the door, they had implemented these rolling tax cuts where they were continually cutting taxes, income taxes, and other things every year by 10%. And so we got to the point where we said we can't do this. We have to raise taxes, and so we pushed right up to the deadline of October 1st and ultimately got bipartisan agreement to raise taxes, almost $2 billion in taxes. And so then at that time, we did a 30-day budget because we had new revenue numbers then. Based on what we agreed to raise taxes, then we had to build a budget based off of those numbers. Well, we didn't know what those numbers were going to be until we actually got the vote on raising the taxes. And so we did a 30-day continuation budget then, but it was a much different scenario. I mean, my frustration, now here I go, I'm going to be careful, but my frustration about this is dumb. We're in this position right now this is not a righteous fight to raise revenue so we can fully fund our schools like we should be, or to fully provide the services that growing families or young families need for their kids. We're fighting like this to pay off a bad road funding deal that should have never happened in the beginning, to paying bad road debt. And we're literally at the verge of shutting down our state government to try to come up with with using revenue sources that we should be looking at to pay for good things to pay off bad road debt. But we can have that conversation maybe on a different day. Sorry. I almost made it. It's 12:50. I almost made it. Sorry. All right. Any other questions? Thank you all. And I mean, so Maddie's putting some stuff in the chat. MyLeap is indicating that they have at least funding, even with the federal government shutdown, for childcare scholarship payments for at least a month. Obviously, if this federal shutdown goes on longer than that, I'm sure other states are probably in even maybe a more challenging position than that. So you'll start to see pressure build on the federal government as some of these programs that are federally funded, if those payments are not able to come out at the federal level, you're going to see a lot of attention and focus from the media and around the federal government shutdown.
And I looked it up. The CAC FP indicates that they have carryover funding and that they will continue to reimburse schools as well as child and adult care providers for meals served in September and October. And we put a link in the chat for more information on that.
All right. Any last comments, Rachel or Tina?
Thanks for having me. And
thank
good
you.
luck
No,
to
thank
all
you
the
both
groups.
again. And thanks everybody for tuning in. And please share this. As Stephen said, this has been recorded. It'll be available on our website. We want people to get this information. Like I said, I mean, as soon as something breaks through and we do get a state budget out there where we actually know funding levels for all these things that people are concerned about, we'll probably be doing either another lunch and learn, or we'll certainly be doing something to get information out to folks. And if anything, if you hear anything else or any other questions come up, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can find us at michiganschildren.org. We want to answer questions. We want to be a resource for folks. Ben's asking where the recording will be. Stephen, do you know where the recording's going to be?
Yeah, so we post the recording to our YouTube page, and it'll also be on our webpage as well.
All right, thanks everybody, and keep after it. I know it's hard, it's frustrating, it's complicated, but I mean the fundamental thing is legislators need to know, elected officials need to know that we want kids and families to be a priority. I mean the budget is a priority setting exercise, and we could be doing a lot better job to make kids and families a priority in this process. Thanks everyone.